Good afternoon. My name is Ginny Costello with Member Services from IHA. On behalf of IHA, I would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar with SGS on security, social responsibility, auditing, and environmental sustainability. Today's webinar will be presented by Brian Whitters, Deputy Vice President of Global Sustainability Services, and Michael Richardson, Senior Project Manager of Life Cycle Assessment and Sustainability Design. Both from SGS, the world's largest inspection, testing, and clarification company in the world. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Michael Richardson.
Thank you, Ginny, and we'd like to also thank IHA and the attendees today. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about these topics. Just a little bit about SGS. You've kind of heard the basic overview, but we were founded about 130 years ago as a grain inspection company, and since then we've grown into the world's leading inspection, verification, and testing company. Among the other services that we're more well known for, we do provide services in sustainability as listed here, some of which relate to the topics that we're going to be talking about today. The presentation's in two parts. In the beginning, we're going to focus on environmental sustainability. We'd like to start by discussing why engage in environmental sustainability. It's something you've probably heard a fair amount about, and some may think of it almost more as a PR or a marketing ploy, but really sustainability runs much deeper than just perception. And it's not just about protecting the environment. Obviously, that's the main initial concern that one would think of, and it is very important, but it's more than just that. Really, it's about, one of the main things it's about is about the better management of finite resources. With a growing population and the growing percentage of people joining the middle class, there's going to be more constraints on resources. And so managing those better is both relevant towards environmental impacts and the bottom line as the cost for those resources increase. Additionally, there are a growing number of regulations governing environmental issues, such as greenhouse gas emissions. In the U.S., air permitting has been initiated for carbon dioxide emissions for certain facilities, and in Europe there are cap-and-trade programs. Both of these first two items actually relate to the third item, the reduction of risk, where investment companies are actually looking at environmental performance. The acronyms here stand for the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and the Carbon Disclosure Project, two groups of investors who are asking companies to report on their environmental performance and rate them accordingly. And this information is used by some investors, so it has relevance to stock price and potential risk as a company. The last bullet item on this list, but not the last on the complete list of why to engage, is also to differentiate one's product and to adjust consumer expectations. By improving the environmental performance of your product, you can set it apart from the competition, providing a competitive edge, and then also you can respond to the growing interest of consumers in environmental aspects of the products they buy. It may not be the very first criteria, but it is something that more and more people are looking at. So what are industry-leading companies doing? Today, the leading companies are really integrating sustainability into their regular business. They're seeing it as good business. One of the measures of good business is anticipating and addressing potential risks and opportunities, and the environmental issues surrounding sustainability fall into those categories as well. Another thing a lot of companies are doing is working in industry or inter-industry groups to address environmental issues. We've listed three sets of industry groups here and the work that they've and the kind of work product that they've been developing. The first is from the apparel industry. It's the Higg Index, and this is a measurement tool that's used to assess suppliers, brands, and products, all related to apparel. The second item is the Level Sustainable Furniture Standard, developed by the Business and Institutional Furniture Manufacturers Association. And this is actually a scoring system that rates products and provides that information to consumers, all based on their environmental performance. And finally, the Sustainability Consortium, which was initiated by Walmart but has a number of retailer and manufacturer members associated with it. And they are doing a lot of work to measure the environmental impacts of a wide variety of product types. And at this point, it looks like they're using that information or going to use that information to influence their buying. So each of these is actually really a measurement tool that companies are applying to the products within their industry, and then in the end, hopefully using that information to improve them. Another thing a lot of leading companies are doing is essentially rethinking, using sustainability as an impetus for innovation. The overall idea is achieving essentially the same goal, but doing it in a different way, in a different physical way. So an example here would be a major shipping company has located a repair center at their shipping hub in a partnership with the manufacturer, so that when a laptop comes in from a consumer, they don't actually then send it on to the manufacturer. It's repaired on the site. In doing that, they've cut down on 2 legs of transport and reduced the fuel consumption. So again, the same goal is achieved, but it's done in a different sort of novel manner. So some efforts to start moving forward. Ideally, to address sustainability, you'd want to develop a holistic plan working to integrate sustainability company-wide. This would involve gaining an understanding of your impacts, starting to measure them, setting some goals with targets for improvement, and then forming specific plans and programs to meet those goals. Again, this is kind of a holistic way to approach it at a company level. Some companies may not be ready to move in that capacity, and they may want to focus on more individual efforts to start. And a few are listed here, measuring important criteria such as GHG emissions. This is something a lot of companies are doing, and it also helps them get an idea of their energy costs, because these are very closely related to energy costs. A couple others that we're going to talk about in more detail, the ones here in orange, improving building and facility operation in terms of energy, water, and waste, and improving performance of a major product line using life cycle assessment or ECODESIGN. Additionally, companies can communicate sustainability initiatives to their suppliers to try to get them on board and help make improvements within their supply chain. First, we're going to focus on the impacts of the product and why should companies work to improve them. The diagram at the right represents the distribution of the CO2 emissions from, let's say, a retailer or a light manufacturer. And so we see the biggest portion comes from electricity, followed by refrigerants and fuels. These are all the emission sources gate to gate for that particular, let's say, retailer or light manufacturer. When we add in all the goods that pass through that organization and look at the CO2 emissions associated with manufacturing, using, disposing, and transporting those goods, what was that orange circle is now compressed into an orange wedge, with the majority of the impact really coming from the goods themselves. So the idea here, the analogy here really, is looking at the picture to the left. If you're only looking at what's going on gate to gate in your operations, you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. So to improve products, though, you need to measure. And one good way to do that is through life cycle assessment. It's not the only way, but it is a good way because it provides a holistic approach to measuring environmental impacts and can set a good basis for improvement. And the concept here is to basically quantify the impacts of the product or service throughout the life cycle. So if we look at the blue diagram in the middle, it's representing all the phases in the life cycle of a product, from raw materials production through end of life and all the transport phases in between. The idea here is to measure the inputs of raw materials, energy, water, so forth, going into each of these phases, and then the emissions to air, water, and soil coming out of each of these phases. And this is a multi-criteria analysis, so it's not just looking at CO2 emissions, but emissions associated with acid rain formation, water footprint, and other criteria. But an important thing to keep in mind is this is just a measurement tool. This is not an end in and of itself. This is an example to show the importance of LCA and what you can see by conducting one. What we have here are two cell phones, the one on the left, which has a solar panel attached to it for power, and the one on the right, which is more traditional. The little numbers you see up here, the 2 and 4, represent the scoring that these phones received through an environmental assessment process where they were rated from 1 to 5, 3 being average. So the product with the solar panel actually performed worse. Now, to understand that, we need to look at all the phases. And the reason this turned out this way is that these particular products have a fairly short lifetime. They also don't use a tremendous amount of energy during that lifetime. So when we look at the whole life cycle of the product, we actually find out that the materials inputs and the energy inputs in the manufacturing phase to create that solar panel are actually not recouped during the use phase, just because of the nature of this particular product. And this is something we can see by doing a life cycle assessment. So ECODESIGN is kind of the next step where we can put life cycle assessment to work to improve products. It's also known as sustainable design. So the major principles of ECODESIGN are really to consider the environmental criteria of the design stage, as well as usual criteria, which are kind of shown here in this diagram. The usual ones being client expectations, technical feasibility, and cost, and we're adding in environmental at this phase. So we want to reduce the environmental impacts without compromising the quality of the product, though. And we want to, of course, incorporate a life cycle approach. And why do we want to focus on the design phase? Simply, that's kind of where you set the trajectory for the product. It may not be where you're spending a lot of money in the product life cycle, but you have the opportunity to determine essentially about 80% of the life cycle impacts, whereas approximately only 20% are then left to the user or other parties involved in the product life cycle. So that's why it's important to focus on the design phase. This is an example of ECODESIGN looking at a particular product, fairly straightforward teapot. So the first step is to diagnose the current environmental impact of the product. To the left, we see a chart showing several impacts. Each of these bars is a different type of impact, from raw materials depletion to global warming. The life cycle assessment shows that the majority of the impact is associated with the use phase for almost all of the different impact categories, except for raw materials depletion, where manufacturing is most important. What this does is enables us to identify where the weakness of the product is, and it looks like the use phase is where we want to focus our improvements. So next we want to integrate ECODESIGN objectives in the design specifications. As far as the methodology, we want to fix reasonable objectives focusing on those weaknesses that we just talked about. We also want to train people involved in the product design and the material sourcing. So the objectives fixed in this new specification were to heat only the necessary amount of water instead of boiling a whole pot of water, and also to stop heating just before the boiling point to save energy on that phase change. The third step, the actual design process, the method involves implementing the design process as usual. However, we want to provide simple tools to support the design team in making the right decisions while still considering cost, technical, and environmental constraints. So the technical solution here was to produce a cup-adjusted dispensing system. So again, we're only heating 1 cup at a time instead of heating up 3 or 2 cups when we only want 1. And also an instantaneous heating system was developed to allow that to happen and also keep the water at a point just below boiling to save some additional energy. The fourth step is to incorporate life cycle assessment again to quantify the improvement. So the diagram to the left is another representation of an LCA for the current product, which is shown in dark orange, and the new product, which is shown in light orange. And the further away the shape is from the center point, the higher the impact. So we can see that the old product actually had a higher impact for 5 of the 6 impacts shown here. And that was in the order of 5 to 30% difference between the two. The new product was only higher in raw materials depletion, but it's those raw materials that actually allow for this product to perform better in all the other categories. Finally, we'd like to be able to communicate on these improvements, responding to, again, consumers' environmental sensitivity and being able to communicate on verifiable and measurable information based on the 2 different life cycle assessments before and after. Some tools for that can be self-declarations, Energy Star labeling, if that's applicable. SGS has a carbon footprint and carbon reduction mark series that could also apply. So I'm just going to change gears now and talk a little bit about the holistic building assessments. Again, this is another tool that companies can use, or another initiative companies can take to work on sustainability. And what we're talking about here is, again, it's a holistic building assessment. So it's a more comprehensive approach to looking at a building and assessing potential improvements when it comes to energy, water, and waste. And we know today that there is a fairly large building stock out there that can benefit greatly from this type of assessment. And this is more than just changing out light bulbs or a straight standard type checklist you might get from a utility company. This is really looking at the building in an integrated approach, so considering the insulation, the HVAC system, the lighting, and other processes all together to come up with really the best plan or plans to save significant amount of energy in the mid to longer term. So the steps in the program and kind of some of the answers that are worked out, it begins with an on-site assessment to determine where the building is leaking energy or water or, in the end, essentially money. That information is analyzed to identify actual improvement options. And then project plans can be developed to target specific energy, water, and waste improvements. In addition to the technical side of coming up with these options and plans for improvement, this work also involves an overview of the economic opportunities and strategic budget planning to help guide these modifications. The issues here really involve the fact that there may be grants, tax incentives, or credits, loan incentives that come into play when looking at both the capital upfront outlay as well as the ongoing savings. Of course, this kind of all boils down to what's the ROI on these type of projects. So one really needs to not only look at the money that you would save from the energy reduction, but also, well, what if your capital cost is reduced because there's a grant, or your running cost is reduced because of some tax incentives. So in the end, the idea here is to provide enough information on a few different options so that companies can make a go, no-go decision on these particular initiatives and also provide information to move forward. We're not talking a full spec of every change, but enough information that they can start working towards making these changes that they determine are really in their best interest, most likely, again, based on the ROI. All right, I know I whizzed through that pretty quick, but we do have another half of the presentation to go, and at this point I'd like to hand it over to Brian Whitters to talk about some auditing related work.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to talk this afternoon for about 15-20 minutes on auditing, and kind of reference back to auditing, whether, is it fashion of the minute, are audits going to go away, or are audits going to develop, or is it really the reality of operating within an international global supply chain? Just to give you, my perspective, the first audit I did was back in 1994 in El Salvador. And every 3 or 4 years, I keep coming up against the debate as to, I think audits have had their day and they'll go away, et cetera, et cetera. So in my opinion, audits are here to stay. They will continue to evolve and they will continue to develop. And today I'm actually in a remote site, so I'm not sitting together with my colleague Michael. I'm attending a conference today on conflict minerals and also on environmental auditing. So that two large issues that are coming down the horizon. I'm sure most people on the call will be familiar with conflict minerals, but also if we take the debate back to environmental auditing has been around for maybe 5-6 years, but there's a real focus now being developed to develop some form of standalone environmental audits. So next, and I apologize for saying next because I'm off-site at the moment, but so these are the type of audits that we do, but the type of audits that, I guess most auditing companies will do. We're heavily involved at the moment with things we refer to as specialist audits. And RBAC are responsible jewellery council audits. I mentioned a little bit about conflict mineral audits and also the California Human Trafficking Act. So these are all individual, almost standalone new types of audits that are coming along. Today, I'm going to spend some time talking about security audits, because I guess the vast majority of the audience today will recognize CT-PAT audits, which is Custom Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, that were developed after 9/11. And I'll talk a little bit about social audits. Again, I've been doing social audits since 1994.
Hey, Brian, I'm so sorry, it's Ginny. Can you just a little louder? We cannot hear you very well.
Okay, let me try. Hold on 1 second.
Thank you.
Is that better?
I'm sorry.
Am I louder now?
Oh, yes, much better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, apologies to the audience. So today I'm going to talk about security audits and social audits, but there are other type of audits out there. Probably one of the first type of audits that was developed was quality audits, or the audience may well recognize that as some form of factory assessment, factory capacity and capability assessments. I mentioned a little bit about environmental audits. They started off environmental audits almost as a bolt-on part of a social audit, but more and more we're seeing requests to undertake a very specific standalone environmental audit. And I think probably part of that will be driven by industry initiatives. One of them, I think Michael mentioned, the HIG Index. So the HIG Index has been put together by the Sustainable Apparel Commission, and this is based mainly on self-certification of facilities around waste, water, and energy. So we see a real drive around additional opportunities on environmental audits. And what I'd like to do is try to clarify the difference between first, second, and third-party audits. Because sometimes we're asked to do a first-party audit, and sometimes we're asked to do a third-party audit. So a first-party audit, in general, is where the owner of the factory or the owner of the company requires an audit, and he asks his own staff to do the audit. So that's what would be referred to as a first-party audit. And although that has credibility at a certain level, in terms of at the retail level and a lot of the manufacturing level, it has its place, but it tends to lack credibility when you put a first-party audit in front of a retailer. A second-party audit is where the factory or the manufacturer contract an independent third party to come in and conduct the audit. And that's the vast majority of the work that SGS CTS does is second-party audits. The third-party audit is where an audit is conducted against a recognized international standard, for example, ISO 9000 on quality, SA 8000 on social accountability, or something like ISO 14001 on the environmental side. So today I'm going to very specifically talk about second-party audits. Next. So the next 4 slides, I just want to kind of map out for you a roadmap for successful implementation of an audit program. This could apply to a social audit, to a security or a quality audit, or to a conflict mineral audit. It's not audit specific, but I think the first thing that you need to tackle is an understanding of what is required from you, either as a buyer or as a factory. And once you understand what is required of you, you need to go through a process of communicating that. You need to proactively communicate that with your customers, whether your customers are retailers or further manufacturers or traders. And then you also need to proactively communicate that with your audit company, whomever that may well be. Hopefully that might be SGS, but whomever your audit company is, you need to be really clear in terms of passing on your understanding of what's required from you as a buyer and what you require of your audit company. When you work with SGS, we insist on putting together what we call an SOP, or Standard Operating Procedure. And the Standard Operating Procedure is what we would refer to as our field instructions. So those are the instructions that we give out to our auditors in Bangladesh, in Guatemala, in China, when there's one set of standard operating practice per program, just to make sure that there is a global approach to the audit program. The third part of this is to acquire a good understanding of the requirements of the international labour standards, because whether you're doing a quality audit or a security audit or a social audit, an understanding of the labour standards is essential. Next. So the second part to your roadmap is, once you have an understanding of what's required of you, begin to put together your corporate strategy and your corporate policy around whichever specific audit methodology you're engaged with. Best practice would suggest that, once you've got your policies and practices, once you understand what it is you need to do, you should assign a dedicated person to manage the issues. Now, what we have seen over the years is all too often it falls to someone in the quality or the technical department to manage these issues. And usually that's because the quality and the technical departments are usually the individuals and teams that are closest to the factories. They do a lot of factory visits. Therefore, they're closest to what's actually happening within the supply base. Once you have got that dedicated person in place, then I would suggest you contact your audit company or your consultancy or whomever you are working with to arrange training for your staff. So make sure that your dedicated person or your dedicated manager becomes almost your in-house centre of excellence on your audit program and on the international labour standards. When you do that, then begin to look at some way to set up your supply chain management system to ensure compliance of your suppliers. And an example of how you may want to do that is once you have your policy in place, once you begin to communicate your policy around, for example, your code of conduct, you need to make sure that as part of your purchase order generation system, there's something within your purchase order that specifically states that the products that are being manufactured for you must be manufactured in line and in accordance with your current code of conduct. And if the goods are found to be manufactured out with that code of conduct, then you reserve the right to reject the goods, for example. And that's just an example of how you begin to embed your compliance within your supply chain management system. Next. So we're now in the stage of beginning to implement your management system. So next stage is contact your audit company to begin to set up your program, to decide. I would assume that most organizations, when they set up programs, will do what is referred to as a risk assessment. So they might have 100 factories in 15 countries. So realistically, you can't begin to audit, all of your factories in all of your countries over the first 3 months. So, you go through a risk assessment, you decide where are the highest risks to your business and to your stakeholders, and work with your audit company to roll out your audit program in those higher risk countries and higher risk products. And some of the higher risk products will be things like toys or electronics. Probably the next stage, once you begin to roll out your program at the very early stage, is you need to arrange some form of supplier training, some form of supplier briefing, just to ensure that your factory and your suppliers are not blindsided when you send them a request to start an audit. So the way that SGS have done this in the past, we've held global summits, and we usually start off in China, places like Shenzhen, Dongguan, Shanghai, and then you go down to other high-risk countries, for example, Bangladesh and India. And then after you've communicated with your suppliers through the supplier training, then begin to implement your auditing activities. And once you have the results of your audits, begin to then put a measuring system in place so that you can begin to benchmark at country level, at product level, and benchmark at supplier level. Next. And once the program is in place, begin to fine-tune the program, because best practice would suggest that the audit programs, they continue to evolve, and they should always be implemented within the supply chain as a continuous improvement program. So when you go in, when you audit a factory, you probably will find on the first audit maybe 30 or 40 violations. So there is no way that a factory will fully be able to implement a corrective action plan around all of those issues. So you just need to work through, where are your highest risks in terms of violations, address them first through root cause analysis. But then the other issues, for example, maybe the factory doesn't have the fire extinguisher at the correct height. That's an important point, but it's not an essential point, and maybe that goes into your continuous improvement plan. And best practices suggest to us now, and it's a relatively new development, that the retailer is putting some form of incentive in place to ensure that the suppliers move towards full compliance. So, if you have factories that are fully compliant with the customer's code of conduct, then there may be the opportunity for you to get additional business because you're compliant, because you have invested time and money in compliance. Next. So on this slide, there are 4 main reasons, in my opinion, why you need to implement an audit program, again, whether it's security, quality, or social. The first is about managing the risk associated with your ever-extended supply chain. 15 years ago, the supply chain was probably, you wrote the order in New York, it was manufactured in North Carolina. But, the reality of life now is the supply chain at the first tier level is long, but it's even longer at the second, third, and fourth tier. So by implementing audits, you begin to manage your risk because you get a better degree of visibility of what's happening within your supply chain. Also, it should help you to manage the brand through the ability to control the image. So if a retailer or a manufacturer begins to initiate, or an NGO begins to initiate a discussion with you about alleged bad conditions in your factory, then you can begin to use your audit program through the crisis management process to begin to defend, your supply chain. To say, we have been in and we have audited over the last 2 years 3 or 4 times. This is what we have found, this is what we know is still wrong, and this is what we are working to improve all through a continuous improvement program. Next. So again, regardless of the audit type, there are 7 main stages that we go through when we conduct an audit. So we do a degree of preparation for the audit, where we send out to the factory pre-audit documentation, and that's to allow us to understand, how many people are in the factory, because the number of people in the factory normally dictates the number of days that is required to conduct the audit. We're also looking for the factory to let us know the languages spoken in the factory, because an important part of the audit is to interview a cross-section of employees. And within SGS, we will only ever interview workers where the language of the auditor is exactly the same as the language of the interviewee. On very, very rare occasions we may use a translator, but we collect that information through audit preparation. We arrive on site, we then do an opening meeting with the senior management team of the factory to take them through what the day will look like, what we need to review, and why we're there. Thereafter we do a site tour. The site tour is always conducted in conjunction with senior management. So we go around, we look at health and safety, we look at the toilets, we look at the water facilities, we look at the cross-section of the workforce. So we're looking for any individuals that look particularly young or particularly old, or that are working in hazardous areas or under hazardous conditions. And when we see those sort of individuals, we take note of their names, and we usually then select them for an interview. The interviews are always held in a room away from the factory floor. They're always held on a confidential basis, where the names of the employees are, we would like to think the names of the employees are never shared with the factory management, but all too often the factory management know the workers that we interview. But what is never attributed is any of the comments from the interviews. So during the interview process, one of the biggest skills of an auditor is to make sure that when he finds issues and when he has to feedback those issues at the closing meeting to the factory management, you will always feed those findings back in such a way that any comments or findings cannot be attributed to any individual that spoke to us during the audit program. When we finish the interviews, we then go through a document review process. So we'll look at wages and our records of individuals. And in some countries, we're faced with issues where we need to have the permission for data protection reasons, to have the permission of the individual that we're about to look at the HR file. We then validate and cross-reference what we find in the document review with what we heard during the interviews and what we saw during the site tour. We then hold a pre-closing meeting, because normally with SGS, we have 2 auditors conducting the interview. So the 2 auditors get together and compare the notes, collect the findings. We then sit together at the end of the day with the senior management of the factory, and we feed back our findings to the factory management at that point. Now all we do is we feed back what we found. We will not and cannot engage in a debate on the findings with the factory management, because all too often the factory owner, the factory manager, will want to give an explanation as to why that happened on that specific day that we were there. Our role as auditors is not to engage in a level of debate. Our role is to report on what we found on that one day or that 2 day, and that's what we do. So we finish the closing meeting, we leave the factory a handwritten report of what we found. Then we'll go back to the office and through our IT system, we then send a final typed up report to our customer, be it a manufacturer or a retailer. Next. So talk a little here on social audits. Now, whether you conduct an SLA audit or an EPI audit or an SA8000 audit, regardless of the audit, they're all audits were conducted against a set of principles. And I've listed out here the most common 12 principles that encompass a code of conduct audit. Now, all of these 12 principles are all based on the ILO core conventions. The ILO has been around since 1919. I'll digress a little bit and give you a little bit of a history lesson. After the First World War, the treaty that settled and finished the First World War was called the Treaty of Versailles. One of the parts of the Treaty of Versailles was that the League of Nations at the time, which was a precursor to the United Nations, agreed to set up an international labour organisation to protect the rights of workers worldwide. So from 1919 to today, the ILO has been in existence, and it's the only part of the original 1919 Treaty of Versailles that's still in place. So if you are setting up your own audit program, and if you choose to set up your own code of conduct, just ensure that all of your code of conduct principles map back to ILO core conventions. And if you need more assistance on that, let me know later on. We can assist you with that. Next. So things that we see under the spotlight are things like forced child labour or freedom of association. And on forced child labour, and child labour on its own is a terrible thing. But we're seeing in some countries, for example in Uzbekistan, where the government of Uzbekistan during the cotton harvesting season closed the schools down, where school children and school teachers are sent out to the cotton fields to pick cotton. Now I know probably some people are saying that there are machines to pick cotton, but when the USSR broke up, a lot of the large cotton harvesting equipment was taken back into the Russian Republic, where countries like Uzbekistan were left with almost no industrial equipment to harvest cotton. So the government of Uzbekistan got around that by using children and teachers and other members of their population to forcibly pick cotton during the cotton harvesting season. Another area that is really a serious issue at the moment is working hours and living wage. Most code of conduct which stipulate that workers in the supply chain should work no more than 60 hours a week. And that's normally 48 hours on regular pay and no more than 12 hours a week on overtime pay. And what we see, and I think the next slide I'm coming on to shortly, will show you that the working hours and the wages paid to workers are not in line with an awful lot of codes of conduct. Next. So this slide kind of gives you a very quick overview of the violations based on the SGS audits that were completed in China over the last 12 months. So you'll see there are two main issues. One, working hours, and one is health and safety. Now, although health and safety is improving, one of the main reasons why health and safety is improving is because it's very easy to see a health and safety violation, and as such, it's very easy to improve on it. It's far more complex on working hours because in China, as you may or may not know, within the Pearl River Delta, there's a lack of workforce. And I know that sounds strange in a country of 1.2 billion people, but in the industrial zone that's referred to in China, the Pearl River Delta, there's something like 3 or 4 million shortfall in people that are prepared to work in our industry. So as such, the people that are working are being either encouraged or forced to work for longer hours for less wages. Next. So I'll talk a little bit on security audits, and as I mentioned earlier, in North America it's generically referred to as CTPAT. Within CTPAT and within the SGS standard approach to security audits, there are 8 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these, or some of these sections, in the next few slides. Next. So in terms of the section around business partner requirements, I think the Customs and Border Patrol in North America will insist on certain things. Some they say you should have, some they say you must have. And what you must have as part of the CTPAT requirements is a documented risk assessment conducted. And I think the CVP every 2 or 3 years come in to review your documented risk assessment and score you on that. They also recommend that you should have procedures and controls in place at the point of loading. So that's at the point where your boxes go into your container to go to the port. And you should have someone there of a management level that is overseeing and ensuring that only boxes containing your product go into your containers. Next. The next one I want to talk a little bit about is container and trailer security. So as part of the CTPAT program and as part of the SGS security program, when the container is fully stuffed, then the doors are closed and they're locked. They need to then be sealed using some form of high security seal, and the little red, green, and the yellow items you see on the left-hand side of the screen, those are high security seals. And each one of them has a specific number. That number should then be recorded on your shipping documents somewhere, so that when you take receipt of your goods in North America, you can review it, first of all, to make sure the seal is unbroken, and to make sure that the seal that's on your container when it arrives is the seal that was on your container when it left your supply chain factory. Next. Next. So again, as part of the program, you should be conducting a 7-point inspection process for your container. And the reason that this is done, this is to look at, for example, if your container is a 20-foot container, you should be measuring to make sure within the internal dimensions of your container that it's almost 20 feet. Because you should be looking for false walls where contraband or illegal immigrants could be stored. So look for false walls at the back, look for false ceilings where contraband can be stored, and also the undercarriage. So this one is referred generically as the 7-point inspection process. And for every container, you should do that. And for every container, you should record the results of your 7-point inspection process. And you need to make sure that you have a trained inspector within your organization that you have accredited to conduct this 7-point inspection process. Next. Over and above the 7-point container process, you then have the 17-point truck and trailer inspection. And as part of the program, every truck and trailer that comes into your facility, whether it's complete or whether it's empty, you should have an accredited person conducting the 17-point truck and trailer inspection. And I don't plan to go into each one of these individually, because I believe the graphic is self-explanatory. But again, you should have that recorded for every truck coming into your facility and every truck leaving your facility. Next. In terms of physical access controls, so if you have a manager who leaves the company for whatever reason, you must have a procedure in place and a recorded procedure in place for getting keys or passing back from those individuals that have left the company. You must have a procedure in place to understand how you distribute keys, how you distribute passes, etc. And specifically for areas where there's a higher risk, so areas, for example, like the final inspection, the final loading, and the shipping area, these would all be deemed to be areas of high risk where contraband could be put into your boxes or where contraband could be put into your containers. You should also have a process in place for any visitors that come into your facilities. First of all, you check their identity when they come to your facility through a review of some form of photo ID. They sign in and they sign out, and when they tour around your facility, you should have some form of process to make sure that they display an ID badge and that they are escorted at all times. Next. So just to give you the final slide, so you can see images of myself, and in the bottom left, Michael. So what you see there is that's the SGS USA sustainability team. We have much larger teams doing similar work in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, China, India, and Thailand. So at that point in time, I'll hand it back over to Ginny and Debbie, and I think we're going to take some questions now.
We do not have any questions at the present time. However, if anyone would like, feel free to either email Brian or Michael with any of your questions. And on behalf of IHA, once again, I would like to thank Brian and Michael and SGS for the time that they've dedicated in preparing such a great presentation. It was very detailed, and it will be on our website at www.housewares.org in our Knowledge Center. And if anyone has any questions for IHA, you can also email me, Ginny Costello, at gcostello@housewares.org. Thank you so much, and have a great day.